All right. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be with you for our final event in the Black Studies Matter series, celebrating not only Black History Month, but today we get to kind of hook on a connector to Women's History Month. Again, this is a multi-campus, multi-school effort. So I am Dr. Iyelli Ichile, and I have my collaborators, Dr. Quito Swan and Dr. Jared Ball, in the chat somewhere. They're out there in the internets with you all. But today is really about Black women. And so I am joined by some of my most favorite colleagues, Black women historians. We have Dr. Jewel Debnam, we have Dr. Shrita Thompson, we have Dr. Bridget Robinson, and Dr. Lily Brown Vincent. And before we get started, as with everything, if I can have some control over it, I would like to set our intentions. Whatever your belief system is, we go into all important discussions of Black life, making sure that we are doing it in the name of all that is just and righteous and uplifting for people of African descent, whatever that means to you. We make sure to honor those who have gone before. Particularly today, we honor the women folk who have gone before. We want to set our intention that our words are strong medicine, not only the words of the panelists here today, but also the words of all within the sound of our voice, in the community, in the chat, all of you all who always have such wonderful things to contribute. And we ask that as we go forward, we find something useful that is said here today. And so with that said, I would like to again welcome you on behalf of Prince George's Community College, UMASS Boston, oh gosh, we have Bowie State, Morgan State, and so many other schools here present today. And so yes, happy Women's History Month, happy Black History Month. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists and tell you all of the wonderful things that I can quickly tell you about her, but also I'm going to show each of our panelists a piece of art. And I'm going to try to allow the audience, the collective here, to get to know the panelist in a different way by how she responds to the art and how she might think of its connection to Black women's history. All right, so first, we have Dr. Bridget Robinson, who is an associate professor at Prince George's Community College. Her research interests include early 20th century eugenics science, reproductive health, and race politics. She recently contributed 2 articles entitled Race Uplift and Compulsory Sterilization to the World of Jim Crow America, a Daily Life Anthology. She's also a proud alumna of the illustrious North Carolina Central University. So that is Dr. Bridget Robinson. Welcome. I like the illustrious, and it's in all caps, guys.
Always, it must be.
It must be. That's right. We also have Dr. Shrita Jacobs Thompson, who is an assistant professor in the social sciences department at Prince George's Community College. He's a former assistant professor of Civil War era studies and Africana studies at Gettysburg College. Her research focuses on Black Marylanders and their experience during the American Civil War and Reconstruction era. Dr. Thompson has presented her work at national conferences such as the Organization of American Historians, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the Black Studies Conference, and the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. She has appeared on C-SPAN 3, a lecture series entitled Lectures in American History. She's provided commentary for the History Channel documentary Aftershock Beyond the Civil War, and she's currently working on 2 manuscript projects. One is a monograph that will chronicle the experiences of Black Marylanders during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and the other is a chapter for an edited book titled The Civil War in Maryland Reconsidered. Welcome, Dr. Shrita Thompson. We also have Dr. Jewel Debnam, who is an assistant professor of history at Morgan State University. In May 2016, she earned her PhD in history from Michigan State University. She received her BA in history and African American studies from the University of Virginia in 2010. Her book project, Fighting for Respect, Black Women in the Charleston Hospital Workers' Strike of 1969, offers a window into the intersections of workers' rights and resistance, the modern civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and Black women's activism. So look, y'all, we've got all of the bases covered, okay? All of them. And then finally, and certainly not least, we have Dr. Layla Brown Vincent, a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. She's currently an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Dr. Brown Vincent earned a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University in her home state of North Carolina, where her research focused on Black racial identity formation in Latin America and the US and its impact on Black radical organizing in the era of Black Lives Matter. She's currently working on her first book manuscript entitled Return to the Source, The Dialectics of 21st Century Pan-African Liberation, based largely on her dissertation research. Dr. Brown Vincent spent all of 2020 as a visiting research fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. So she just got back from South Africa, where her research expanded to examine the crisis of racial capitalism and the COVID-19 pandemic. Her most recent scholarly work, entitled The Pandemic of Racial Capitalism, Another World is Possible, can be found in From the European South, a transdisciplinary journal of post-colonial humanities. All right, so goodness my gracious, okay? If you didn't know, you are in the presence of greatness, you are in the presence of high intellect, rigorous scholarship, and again, that's right, the beacons are here, and I am just honored to, and just so excited to have these women with us tonight. It's a special treat. It's a wonderful way, again, to wrap up this series. Now that I've introduced them on paper, I am going to share my screen and share a piece of artwork by Harmonia Rosales. I'm not even going to tell you the title. What I want to do is I'm going to go counterclockwise from my screen. So that means I'm going to start with Dr. Jewel Debnam, and I'm going to ask you to respond to the image when I pull it up. Okay. So let's see. Can you all see the image?
No. Okay, wait.
No?
We can see it now. I can see it.
Okay. Oh. So this is a piece of art by Harmonia Rosales, another a Black woman artist. And so I thought it was apropos. So Dr. Debnam, just really quickly, just a couple of sentences. What do you see here?
I don't know. The purple thing kind of looks like a brain, but I'm not sure if that's what that is. I guess it's like, I would say like a Black representation of like more sort of classical, maybe Greek mythology. It looks like mythology, maybe. I'm not sure. This is not my favorite period of art, as y'all heard. I did the 20th century. So with regard to sort of what she's calling back to, I don't know. Reaching back. I can't tell who's reaching back and who's reaching forward. The one person on the left looks like she's reaching to be with everyone else. I don't know.
I like that. That's a good start. Reaching back, and we don't know, right? I like that it's unclear. Maybe that's on purpose. Okay, so who is next? I'm gonna just go down the list. Dr. Thompson, what do you see?
Are those people behind the woman? Are those faces? I want to make sure I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, it's like children. Yeah. Okay, I got it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is it my turn?
Well, whoever. I had called Dr. Thompson. Whoever wants to speak on it.
Okay, I think Bridget's having problems hearing. So I'll weigh in. So it looks as if the one Black woman in the pink dress, she looks like an elder, and she's reaching toward. Okay, the picture just like okay, she's reaching, and it's a little small, so I'm trying to. Okay, and she's reaching. I think I would agree that she's reaching towards the other woman, and she's on one side with other people. And they're trying to reach for the Black woman on the other side. So it's beautiful, beautiful image. But that's what I see, an ancestor giving direction to another Black woman.
I like that. That's important that we're like bringing that term ancestor into the conversation and reaching back. So it's building on the reaching back to another Black woman and maybe even on some other levels. All right, Dr. Brown Vincent, what do you see?
Well, I don't see the image anymore, but okay. You know, so I see all those things, but I'm also trying to figure out. I'm also looking at like the expressions on their faces, because the woman that's sitting down feels like she's willing to be held, but doesn't necessarily look like she's ready to go. And like, I don't know, the woman that is in the crook of the arm of the older woman looks angry. And so I don't know, like I don't know, like in some respects, like I see the ancestor healing, but then I also see like just multiple iterations of ourselves. Like one person, whether that's over different times, whether that's dealing with different issues, like I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot of things going on for me.
That's good. I'm enjoying that. So, okay, Dr. Robinson.
Hi. I'm
Hey.
sorry, my sound went out again. I'm sorry. I don't know what was said because I lost sound, but I think the thing that strikes me, because right now I'm teaching ancient Greek history at this moment, and so we were just having a conversation about beauty and the interpretation of beauty through the lens of Greek mythology. So when I'm looking at just the structure, particularly of the male figure here, it's almost a perfect mirror to what you see in classical Greece era, which is like this hyper masculine culture that emphasizes the body and the proportions. So I don't know what was said before me, but I just kind of wanted to draw that out, that it does kind of put me in that classical Greece space in terms of its influence, especially since people consider, right, sometimes incorrectly, Greece to be the birthplace of civilization, so to speak.
Yes. Okay. All of the above. I'm loving this. Okay. So thank you so much for indulging me in this activity, everyone. I see all of those things as well. I read up a little bit on Harmonia, so I had like a little bit of an advantage, but I do definitely think this is like subverting the kind of ancient Greek style of painting and representing images, particularly sacred images. So all up in what you all were saying, you're hearing this conversation about relationship and identity. And I think that, looking at the fact that you do have Black women in every stage or age of life, you have an elder, you have little children, you have younger women, you have some apprehension, maybe this is heaven. I didn't even think of this before, but I think that this woman, the elder mother and the children are in a womb. I think that's a womb. I don't know. And and so instead of, like you said, Dr. Robinson, being kind of male-centered, this picture is taking all of these traditional male-centered kind of classical art forms and inverting them and turning them on their heads. Like, we're making this all women, all women-centered, right down to even like whatever this contraption is that Granny and the crew are flying in. So is this heaven? Is she ready to go? Does she have more work to do? Like this woman who's reaching out. Is it Eve? I think someone in the chat said it was God touching Eve. Is this Black elder woman God in someone's imagining or worldview? Right. So I think there's so much to say about how we approach scholarship based on kind of like what we tend to focus on, what we tend to notice. Some of us kind of really focus on relationships. Some of us focus on symbolism and colors. I think the first thing Dr. Debnam said is it looks like they're in she's in like a bubble, right? So we're looking at form and structure and how those can impact a scenario. I think some of us are looking at emotions and kind of like history from a psychological perspective. We want to answer the why question. So I thought that there was so much in this, and so I really appreciate you all for going there, and we get to hear you talk. So that said, as Black women historians, my first question for you all, and I'm going to get to ask all the first questions, and then we're going to open it up for the community to ask you all some questions, is who are your major historical unsung Black women? Like, who are the Black women that you have studied in your work, who you believe people should be talking about more, learning about more? Who are the Black women stories that we have forgotten? Yeah. And that can be individuals or groups. Anyone can jump in and go first. I don't want to pick.
Okay, everybody's being shy. So I will say, when I first started working in this area on Civil War and Reconstruction, I didn't find a lot of Black women who were doing this work in this space. And so it was actually refreshing to have a advisor and a mentor like Dr. Edna Green Medford, who was in this space, who was making space for other Black women to come into this space and do this sort of work and tell the stories of Black women who lived and labored during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Since then, I've fallen in love with the work of the Bowie Glymph. I really appreciate the work that she has done in this space. I've had my students read her work, and they found real fulfillment in having a nuanced perspective about Black women during slavery, as well as Civil War and Reconstruction. And so those are my two picks for this particular question.
I just wanted to note that Dr. Edna Green Medford teaches at the illustrious Howard University. And okay, so tell us a little bit more about Favolia Glymph. I never get her name correct. Glymph. What is her perspective? What does she add to the conversation about Black women's history?
Well, I think her work, actually, I have all my books set up here. Right. Out of bondage, right, was a really good one that spoke to the relationship between Black women and white women, and gave us a more nuanced perspective about all of that. So this was one of the books I assigned when I was at Gettysburg College, and really inspired one of my students to dig even deeper into looking at Black women, particularly during the Civil War. And she's continued on in that career. So I've really appreciated the way she's expanded our understanding of Black women during this critical time period.
Awesome. Anybody else want to share more influences? Thank you. We got a growing book list.
Well,
Were you going to say something, Bridget?
I'll go ahead. So for me, the first I would have to say is when I arrived at NCCU, and I think, if I'm correct, like everyone had to take some version of like a world history, so to speak. And so I know that my schedule said Lindsay, but even though I'm at an HBCU and I'm kind of new on campus, I was expecting a white man to kind of walk in the room, because who else would be teaching this kind of history? And so when the professor walks in, and not only is it a woman, but it's a Black woman, and just how she presented herself, her clothes, the layers, the accessories, the makeup, the hair, it was like so regal and so royal. And my mouth dropped, because up until that point I just assumed I was going to go to law school. But I remember watching her, and I was like, well, whatever she does, I want to do that. Like, tell me what she does and how she did it, and that's who I want to be. And fortunately, I got the chance to study under her throughout my master's program. And she kind of taught me that I don't necessarily have to kind of say, well, I'm going to do feminist studies, or I'm going to do Black feminist studies. She was like, no, you can study the world, because Black women are everywhere. So she's always, like, for me, the trailblazer. And then one woman scholar that I really love and I assign is Gretchen Gerzina. She was on my reading list in every European course I took in my master's and PhD program. She wrote a book called Black London, which was really transformative in making sure that people understood that Black people, particularly Black women, existed in London before World War II. And it's kind of becoming more of a popular topic because, you know, you have shows like Bridgerton, which are kind of bringing that, you know, conversation to the forefront. So those are my two, you know, Dr. Lydia Lindsay and being able to be mentored by her. And then also Gretchen Grzina, seeing a Black woman who is studying, you know, 17th, 18th century London, and trying to piece those narratives together. It was really kind of influential for me.
All right, I'll go. I'll mention Claudrina Harold, who is the chair of the history department at the University of Virginia. But when I met her, she was an assistant professor. It was my first semester of my first year, and I took her Black nationalism seminar. And that was probably my first time taking, well, as an adult, I guess, taking an African-American history class. And that probably set the stage for everything I've done since. I was able to take, she ended up being my advisor for my undergraduate degree. And as a scholar, I admire her willingness to be creative. She's recently gotten involved in making short films, and her newest book is about gospel music. So she is a scholar I admire and have since I met her.
Awesome. Claudrina Harold. Yeah, absolutely. She's such a good mentor. She's very student focused in her approach. Yeah. Awesome. What you got, Dr. Brown Vincent?
So I will echo Bridget's praise of Dr. Lydia Lindsay. Although when I was in undergrad, I didn't have many classes with her, and it was more so because of the subject matter that I was interested in. But if I'm going back to my time at NCCU, Baina Muhammad is, you know, she's my person. I was on the phone with her for like 3 hours today, just talking about my life. And so I have a particular appreciation for the way Black women teach and mentor and care for each other, even as we move beyond whatever the confines of the institutional spaces we were in. But also, I should say, I'm not a historian. I'm an anthropologist, and so the women that I'll name two. So Lelia Gonzalez is an Afro-Brazilian woman who really contributed to the sort of study of feminism and Black women's life in Brazil. Obviously, somebody, you know, for me, I'm always interested in Black women on the left, so people like Claudia Jones, but there are two particular women that for me during my time in Venezuela often came up. And the two women exist in different time periods. So one of whom is Hipólita Bolívar, and the other is Argelia Laya. Hipólita Bolívar was an enslaved Black woman who was a caregiver. She's referred to in the archives, obviously, as like the wet nurse of Simón Bolívar. And one of the things that I found really interesting about the way the Afro-Venezuelan community evoked Hipólita's name was that they always talk about, you know, Simón Bolívar was a white man born to an aristocratic family. But he's also known as the great liberator of Latin America. And one of the claims that the Afro-Venezuelan community makes is that all of his ideas about liberation and equality and humanity come from his time being reared and cared for by this woman, Hipólita. And so a part of what I see there is not just making a claim about her influence on him, but making a kind of, almost like a kind of primordial claim on the role of Afro-descendant people and Afro-descendant women in particular on this notion of freedom in the Americas. And then the other person is a more contemporary woman, but also another Afro-Venezuelan woman. Her name is Argelia Laya, passed in the 90s. But in the 70s, she was a leader of the feminist movement. She was also a leader in the Communist Party. She was one of the only women, Black women, Afro-Venezuelan women that ascended to leadership in the Venezuelan Communist Party. And for me, her role in bringing together this sort of radical kind of politics, this kind of critique of socioeconomic structures, and also a particular kind of reading about her experience as an Afro-Venezuelan and as a woman. They are two people who, after this book project, I'm really interested in pursuing something larger, because a lot of the way they exist is in a sort of folkloric kind of memory. And I think that both of those women deserve their shine. They deserve their biographies. And so
their flowers.
Exactly.
They deserve their flowers. That's awesome. Thank you so much. These are really important answers. And again, now we have almost like a working list of women to look to, think about. I also want to put another Howard University Black woman scholar on the list, Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis, who who really helped me think seriously about history and do history and not be all shy about it when I was there as a grad student. You know, like I remember I was trying to write a term paper on go-go, women in go-go music, in DC's go-go music. And I had all these interviews set up, and she told me, you got to interview Chuck Brown. And I was like, first of all, my paper's about women. Second of all, it's Chuck Brown. I don't know nobody. I am a lowly grad student. I have no juice. And she was like, okay, well, you need to have this interview with Chuck Brown or you're going to fail. Like, do it or die. Like, she gave me no options. She was like, you're either going to do it at the top level or I'm not even going to grade it. Like, I was like, Chuck or bust, right? So, no, but I did it, and I got to interview all of these really amazing women in go-go music who have been really marginalized, and they were so relieved to have someone to listen to their stories and actually care about the roles that they've played in go-go music. And it's something that you said, brought it up, Dr. Brown Vincent, which is, just women mentoring and kind of influencing from a perspective of even just nurturing, you know what I mean? And just in a behind the scenes kind of way, but like implanting certain ideas and a certain consciousness in what is happening, a certain awareness in what's happening. That was really important. And yeah, so having that woman historian behind me to keep that light, that heat up under me was really important. So yeah, thank you for that. My next question is, as women who not only study Black women, but also teach it, can you speak to any challenges you may have in terms of doing research on Black women, and then maybe, if not, challenges that you might face in terms of teaching about Black women, like infusing it into the curriculum in the classroom?
I think I'll take that one first, because I just finished a piece for the Association of Black Women Historians, and the call for essays or blog posts was really centered around that limitation, right? What is it like trying to reclaim this history in terms of the data? And so I drew on my experiences when I was working on my master's thesis. I was trying to write a narrative of the sterilization program in North Carolina. And I found the archives to be very hostile in terms of their availability to me, in terms of the data that was available, how sketchy the data was, particularly when it came to Black women, sterilizations and things like that. Even down to, the pagers or the people behind the desk, were kind of hostile to that as well. And it was a very isolating time in terms of research. I felt like I was doing something that I had no business doing.
Okay, wait. Sorry to interrupt. So, okay, so you are studying a program by which they sterilize Black women.
Well, they sterilize white and Black women, but towards the end of it, it starts to become disproportionately poor Black women.
Okay,
yes.
and they were treating you in a hostile way as you went to go to the archives and get the material and study.
I mean, it's a nasty history, and I think this was right around the time where the story was breaking nationally that North Carolina had this 50-year-old program where they were forcibly sterilizing poor women, whether Black or white. So it was coming to national, prominence, and it was like a nasty little piece of history. And they kind of wanted to protect, I guess, that story and kind of control the narrative of what that looked like. And so I was met with a lot of resistance, sometimes outward hostility. people who did not want to talk. Because like you said, the interviews is the most important part. And my advisor was like, you need interviews, and coming up against that wall of silence. And so the archives were just a very hostile place. And it was some place that I didn't want to be. I hated being there. But then I started to realize, based on my training and based on the Black women who've been mentoring me, they've always taught me that the silence is what you listen for the most, right? That just because you can't see it or you can't hear it doesn't mean it's not there. So I think that's one of the things that I think is special about being a Black woman and a scholar, is that we're trained to listen for the silence, because that's what's loudest, right? That's what comes across. So trying to go into the archives and realize that, dang, even people who look like me, stories aren't worthy enough. Seeing that a lot of these Black women, their names weren't even recorded fully. They were given an initial, or the way that they were talked about. This person is 14 and fast and a fresh girl who's deserving of sterilization, or she's feeble-minded. Like it was such a difficult research period for me, but it was also very transformative, because it taught me that I needed to develop a different relationship with the archives, as opposed to my male cohorts or my white cohorts. My relationship with the archives has to be different.
Yes, that is such an important point. Please, and then for those of you who are still going to answer this question, yeah, I would really like to hear that part, like how it impacted you personally, because I also feel like when we are Black women studying these stories of Black women and trying to unearth them, essentially, and to some degree fighting for them, like how that impacts us personally. So whoever's next.
Okay, I think my experience really aligns with Dr. Robinson. In doing my research for my work, I went into the pension files and spent countless hours going through each of those files, trying to recover the voices of Black women. So, of course, we all know that the archives is typically limited in terms of what we can reclaim of Black women's voices. So we always have to go to some non-traditional sources in order to try to get at those voices. But I found them in the pension file. But like Dr. Robinson, it was very interesting because I looked at a lot of depositions that were embodied in these pension files, particularly of widows, women who were widows of members of the United States colored troops. And oftentimes it was heartbreaking to have to see these women try to lay claim to their relationships with these men. And it was often difficult to see the counter testimony, right, of those who were trying to either a pension agent who was asking very, interesting questions about her relationship with this deceased soldier, or the community members, sometimes even Black community members who were giving testimony, depositions about these Black women. In one particular case, there was a Black woman who applied for a pension for her minor daughter. And a couple of the community members, questioned whether this child even belonged to this deceased veteran, and made statements about how she had been turned away from the church because she had men coming in and out of her home at all times of night, right? So, those are sort of things that I found in going through those pension files. And it's very depressing to see what these Black women had to overcome, particularly in trying to reclaim family, their relationships, their marriages, and their children's connection to these deceased veterans. It was actually quite depressing on many days to see what they had to go through to be able to reclaim that.
Wow. They delegitimize our marriages, or try to prevent us from having marriages, or put taxes on marriages. And then when we need to demonstrate that we have marital relationships, all of a sudden we're the ones at fault for not having this documentation. Wow. So yeah, more. Anybody else?
I'll add some comments since I study more recent history. Some of the difficulties that I've faced since some people are still alive, or they have relatives who are close relatives, meaning children who are still alive. Not everyone is willing to make their mothers, in particular, stories available. So in some cases, even for women who are more well-known, their families can be quite protective, which I understand. But it is difficult when you're trying to sort of tell a history and you know they have papers, but you can't get access to them. So you have to, in many ways, as Dr. Robinson said, read the silences, be able to read the archives that do exist against the grain, or comb sort of public comments these people may have made to construct a version of them, which might not actually be the whole story, but it's part of it. It's kind of like what Jean Theo Harris did with Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, where there's an archive that is now accessible, but wasn't when she was writing the book. And so she had to sort of work around everything. And for women whose children are still alive, they should have control of the archive, but I think personally, as a scholar, I would love for them to want their mother's stories to be available to correct the record.
Absolutely. And we have some comments and lots of stuff going on in the chat. I urge everyone in the chat, although there is lots of intensity going on over there, that we focus really on what's being said. Like, I think there is a connection here. We're talking about relationships, right? And reading against the grain, which is something we all have had to do as scholars of the Black experience. Just, you know, and also for those who have posed questions in the chat, our two other doctors, Dr. Ball and Dr. Swan, are collecting your questions. So we will get to them at another point, and then we will also have all of the panelists provide whatever social media they're comfortable with for you all to follow their work. All right, Dr. Brown-Vincent.
So the first thing I want is just echo everybody's comments about reading the silence. I mean, that's the thing about the woman that I mentioned before, Hipólita Bolívar. I mean, most of the time she just referred to as La Negra Hipólita. She's just the Black Hipólita, like that's, you know, and then, you know, and so a part of why ethnography kind of speaks to me is because no matter what exists about her in the archive, what's also important to me is the power that she takes up in the community, right? And so that's why the stories, I think, the way that they continue to live on in the present, I think, is also really important. And the way people, you know, hail and evoke these figures in order to signal certain types of things. I would also say, I mean, you know, I think some of the issues about doing this kind of research are very similar to some of the issues that exist when we're teaching these kinds of issues. And it's similar to some of the stuff that's happening in the chat, right? I am very much past a point in my life where I feel like I have to make a claim to anyone about what it means to simultaneously interrogate gendered oppression, racial oppression, and economic oppression. And so to be able to call out and signal all of those at the same time is really important to me. And I don't actually need to entertain a conversation about which one is primary, because even in the ways they all have taken on their own kinds of lives. And when they come together, they create multiple kinds of oppressions, but they also exist separately in different kinds of ways. And I think that those of us who pay attention to that level of nuance, we understand that. And so like, and so a part of even this conversation, you know, like people are triggered when they hear the word feminism. And a lot of what happens when they hear the word is that they stop listening after that. And they don't actually, and all of their assumptions about what they think feminism is what they interact with, as opposed to the kind of directive that you just offered, Iyelli, which was about actually listening to what the conversation is, right? Because I think so many people hold on to this notion that feminism equals trauma with men, which it does not. feminism equals hatred of men, which it does not, right? Feminism is about a particular kind of analytical framework that allows us to interrogate the multiple ways in which we experience oppression in a given society, right? And so for me, I think it's important to always pay attention to the multiple ways that those things interact.
Well said. Thank you for that. I think that the point really is to really, again, listen. I really appreciate that. We have, again, a rare opportunity and a rare coming together of some very serious Black women scholars, and we're here to learn. We're here to learn by, from people who not only study this intensely at a high level, but who live it, right? So there's that. So I guess in terms of teaching, have you had a lot of challenges with that kind of thing in the classroom since we're there? Pushback or even kind of questions being raised about why it matters to set aside space for Black women and their narratives in the history or in the cultural studies? Have you faced any of that? And how do you respond to that? How do you, besides the eloquence that we just heard?
I think.
Oh no, you can go ahead.
Okay. Fortunately, since I teach at Morgan, I haven't had the issue with people questioning why Black women are centered in my on my syllabi, perhaps like even including the authors I choose for my graduate classes, usually all Black women if I can. I haven't had issues with that. More of the issues come from conversations and terminology students are used to using when they're talking about women in particular, that we have to sort of have a ground rules conversation about how we refer to women in my classes, because both male and female students and use female a lot, in place of women, and it is not something I don't know that they think about. And so sort of starting and the class saying, this is what how we're not going to talk about women by referring to reproductive organs, for instance, as their identity. And it sort of forces them to think, I think, about what they're saying. And then sort of, I have had issues with both, with all students who do have an aversion to feminism and don't know what it means. So I think it's out in the ether, people's relationship to that, just the word is polarizing in ways that can prevent like real conversation. However, once you sort of break it down to the most simple definition, I think people are more, students are more receptive and we can actually have constructive conversations. But I think it's just sort of introducing them to a different vocabulary that facilitates good conversations. And for me, it's not sort of a question of adding Black women to the discussion. They're always present, mainly because even in an African-American history class, for instance, most people already know sort of the men who would usually be mentioned in a given time period. So just talking about the women or prioritizing the women gives them a different perspective.
Right, agreed. Does anybody have similarities to that story, to that approach?
Yeah, I do. I think for me, it's when I walk into the classroom, it's kind of on my sleeve. Like, I am a feminist, and then all of the type of stereotypes or images that people might think about what a feminist is. And I tell people all the time, like, no, I do believe in chivalry. I do believe that men should, cut grass and take out trash. I don't hate men, or I don't see a world where men aren't a part of it. I just want to kind of change the way that we understand relationships and the ways in which women, relate to men and vice versa, and change that language. So there's always kind of a pushback when students kind of find out my politics, and they have a misunderstanding of what my politics are. And then, as was stated before, you have to kind of have a conversation, or like a come to Jesus moment. Like, okay, these are the words that we're not going to use. These are the ways that we're not going to refer to women, and having to kind of explain why female as a part of your everyday vocabulary is not necessarily okay. But outside of that, not really having to deal with it from a racial aspect, because when I taught in mostly white or non-Black settings, it's like they understood why I would be Black woman focused. It's when I'm teaching in front of mostly Black students, they're kind of like, well, why do we have to learn this, right? Because they don't necessarily see the difference between, if we're talking about like Black history, it was just Black history. They don't necessarily understand that you kind of have to give more nuance, that in this Black history, we're going to have some gender conversations as well.
Yeah. I think that can have a lot to do with what school you are in. You're absolutely right, and what group of students you're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
It depends. Yeah, because some semesters, I'll give my students something to, like, a list of things to read, and it's all men. No one questions it. And then I give them a list with all women to read, and they're like, "What is this? Why there's no man on it?" And and then some groups don't react. And so there's, there are a lot of different ways that it plays out in the classroom. I think my lead-in is always what's our stuff and what's not our stuff. I think feminism has been defined in some really simplistic ways, and certainly in some white ways, right? That really don't apply to Black women, to women of African descent. And we have taken the charge in defining what our gender relationships and our gender identities look like for ourselves. And, so we've, in the chat, we've seen terms like Pan-African feminism and Africana womanism and things like that. So African women, Black women have been a part of this conversation. But I think to the point that was made earlier by Dr. John Vincent, sometimes people will throw the word feminism in there. So people, so that they don't have to listen to the nuances and the cultural specificities of, there are different ways of looking at this. There are different goals within this, right? And so, yeah, if you say it's feminist with a big, broad, crude brushstroke, people get to tune out instead of really engaging with the idea of not devaluing women. It's so interesting why we can't just agree on that part. Because we're caught up in the terminology. But I do hope we can return to the terms that we do like, or we do use, or we do find meaningful later. I guess my only last question, since I get questions, does anybody else want to tackle this question before I move on?
I was gonna say,
go ahead.
So the first part, in terms of teaching, I do have to say, like, I get a lot of self-selection with students, which I'm very fortunate. I'm very happy that most of the students that come into my classrooms, wherever I've been, so that's been at Duke, at NC State, at UNC, and Bucknell, small liberal arts school, at UMASS Boston, a predominantly non-white public school. My class is called Africana Feminisms, that's what you signed up for.
Right.
Like, when my class is called Blacks in Latin America or Afro Latin America, that's what you signed up for. And so, like, I often, like, and you experience different kinds of push. Like some students, like, I do have occasionally some students, I think, who are, and I take it seriously when people are genuinely trying to share the way their vision of a thing has been shaped and really trying to ask questions, right? So, like, I always tell my students, like, I want you to come in here and say the controversial things, say the ignorant things, say whatever, because if you don't, we can't interrogate it. And I'm not necessarily saying I'm coming in here to tell you what to think, but this is an intellectual environment. We're coming to interrogate our thoughts, right? To interrogate our relationships with each other and our approaches. But then I do, like, it is important to me to like, I remember even when I was, and this is not particularly on the question of women, but on race, I remember I was teaching an intro to Africana studies class. And I had this one white student who kept talking to me about poor white people. I'm like, dude, there is no refutation of the ways in which poor white people experience this world. Like, poverty is effed up for all of us. However, you signed up for Introduction to Africana Studies. That's what we're doing here. So,
however,
exit stage left if that's not what you're here for. And I do have to say that, like, you know, I think that a lot of the assumptions that people have about people who identify in certain ways, I probably carry them with me in the same way Dr. Robinson says she carries it on her sleeve. So I don't necessarily get a lot of pushback. But what I will say is that no matter what the subject is that I am teaching, I always have a feminist woman section of my class. It's always a third of the class, and I name it that way because I like whether that's the making the African diaspora, whether that's my Afro Latin American studies, whether that's social movements in Latin America. We're always going to have a particular kind of conversation about women because of the ways the contributions of women are already marginalized, and so like it's a thing that like I don't know because I went to an HBCU. You know, I just remember the particular kind of ethos that our professors gave us. And it's like, you know, when people start questioning, well, why is everybody we read Black? Well, why? Everybody you read for the last 13 years was white. So you ain't going to lose nothing by spending this 15 weeks reading these Black people. So we're going to spend this 15 weeks reading these Black women. That's what we're going to do. Okay. And I just
oh, that's right.
That's just my, you know, that's the way that's the way I interact with my students. And I come in there from day one. So like, you know, you can speak your mind, but this is what we're doing here.
Yeah. It's balance. It's what you signed up for. And it's just, and again, it's universal balance. Since this is a Black women panel and I am a Black woman, I just want to call out Michael Myers in the chat. You need to stop. I really need you to leave because now you're being like personal. You said you were going to look up Dr. Brown Vincent and it read threatening to me. I'm not with that. So if you can't be peaceful, you got to go. I need you to log out. Thank you. Appreciate it. He blocked. All right. Moving right along, family. I really appreciate the fact that you create intentional space for the interrogation of Black women and Black feminisms in your class. I definitely think that, it's really amazing that people don't notice the absence of Black women in so many different places. It's conspicuous to us, but then when we try to create space for it, for some people, it's just not okay.
Can I just say something really quick that's really important that I wanted to say is that kind of echoing Dr. Brown Vincent is that feminism for me in terms of, you know, scholarship and research, it came because I'm in the archives, I'm working on my dissertation, but then at the same time having a personal life and personal struggles. And as I'm researching, you know, some of the participants in my dissertation, like Mary Church Terrell and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin and Fannie Berry Williams, what I saw come across was a frustration that I felt, but I didn't have a language for, that I wasn't able to articulate, you know, frustration with the world, frustration with politics, frustration with invisibility, frustration with white people, Black men, the church, right? And reading these conversations in the late 1800s that these Black intellectual women were having mirrored the feelings that I was having at that time, which was like, what, 2017, 2016. And these women gave me a language. So they informed not only my research, but my personal life, right? So for me, I can't help but show up in the classroom with that, because if it wasn't for reading those Black women intellectuals, I would not have a language to articulate my own thought process or my own identity, which feminism is definitely a part of it. So for anyone who doesn't necessarily think that they have to read, you know, Black women scholars or anything like that, you are sorely lacking a huge piece, right? Because, you know, your history is not well rounded. Like I always tell my students, you check every major moment, every major movement. You know, you check the soles of our feet. Women have marched, women have bled, women fried fish to sell fish plates for the March on Washington. 3 Black women gave us the language of Black Lives Matter. Like Black women have always been at the forefront of community and building. And I think their critiques have definitely informed and shaped me, who I am personally as well as professionally.
Absolutely. Well said. I think for me, that's it's that we sometimes we get caught up in the isms and at that like broad level, but I think there are just so many other concepts and vocabularies and, like you said, language that come from studying Black women that are useful for us. And like that feeling that you got, like that frustration or those feelings that you needed words for and language for, like I totally relate to that. That's where everywhere I go, I talk about modernity. Like it's a theory that was created by Black women scholars to talk about a certain ethic, a certain approach to movement building, a certain approach to community building and relationships. And I needed somebody to express that for me, right? And I needed to lean on Black women to give me the language I needed. The frustration I feel, for instance, and another example is like watching CNN, and I'm really excited that they're talking about enslaved Africans and how we taught the Western medical world about inoculation, which eventually becomes vaccination, right? Since everybody's thinking about vaccinations, but they're only talking about this one formerly enslaved man, Onesimus. And I'm like, what about the entire group of women, thousands of African women from the Gold Coast who were practicing this on babies during the weaning period? Y'all just want to focus on the one dude, when this is like such a foundational part of so many West Central African cultures. And all the women know it. It's like, you know what I mean? It's a part of who we are, but that gets marginalized. And we're just looking at this one guy. We were doing this on plantations and in labor camps all over this country. And yet, but again, if you say there's a problem with Black women, all of the thousands of Black women and their own cultural knowledge and their own women's-based cultural tradition being silenced and suppressed in the service of this one guy, like if you say that, it's a problem.
Right.
Instead of saying, no, we need the record to be straight. We need so again, creating a language for us to make sure that we're telling the whole story first and foremost of who we are and who we have been. I think we need the vocabularies for that. If we're going to understand resistance, liberation movements of any type at any time period, we have to understand Black men and women work together, but we have to be honest about where we are, the hegemonic concepts of where we are, that in spite of our best intentions will still silence women. So we have to do the work to pull them back out of those margins, and that's part of how we do that. And I think people need to really just accept that and like use the tool like unapologetically. So my final question is it's just a general question. What is one historical story, since we're all storytellers in some way, or a cultural story, something that that's specific to your research and your wheelhouse, something you've learned through studying Black women that you wish everybody knew, you could shout it from the rooftop, something that's super inspiring to you? What's that story? And then we'll open it up for everybody else to ask questions.
I can't remember the specific details of it, but it was a story about Ida B. Wells, and it's kind of like she was giving a talk or something like that at a church somewhere in the Deep South. I can't remember the specifics because it was a long time ago when I read it. But she was giving a public speech, which for her time was not proper of a woman, let alone a Black woman. A lot of Black male leaders in her time, felt that, Black women were being unfeminine by pushing into male spaces, conversations about Black progression and uplift. And so she's giving this speech in front of a congregation, and she gets on a train and she's going back home. I think she's going to Memphis. Somehow someone sent her a letter that the preacher of that church was talking about her in a way that she didn't appreciate. So she got on a train back down to the South, walked into the church. She walked in on kind of like a deacon's meeting, so to speak, and she held it hostage until the pastor apologized. And she kind of had this attitude of like, no, your apology needs to be as loud as your disrespect. So the next Sunday, she made the pastor publicly apologize to her for some of the things that he said about her to his congregation after her speech. And that story kind of always just stuck with me, because I think about the work that Ida B. Wells was doing, which we wouldn't even know about lynchings to the extent of it if it wasn't for her. We wouldn't, have a major contribution to race uplift if it was not for her. But even within her own cohort, she's being silenced and disrespected at the same time. And it was just such a powerful story, but it also just spoke to how petty sometimes Black women could be. Like, you're not going to disrespect me in my work. So it's just always a story I always remember.
That's an awesome story. Your apology has to be as loud as your disrespect.
Yes, yes.
Woo! I'm going to use that.
Okay, so one of the stories that I came across in doing my research, it was a Black woman who was living in a camp during the Civil War and right after, and there was a representative that had been sent to work in this camp to set up a school in the camp from the American Missionary Association. And this gentleman was getting so stressed out because he was trying to get this Black woman to marry the man who she was cohabitating with. And so you see all of these letters coming from him about these conversations he's engaging her in order to try to get her to enter into a marriage with this man right after the Civil War is over. And she continuously declines his offer. And so that was always so inspiring to me, because she was, exercising her autonomy, her right to marry or not marry. And it was so frustrating to this missionary who had come into this space to try to continue what had been done to her under slavery, and that is to direct her in the ways in which she, should live her life as a free woman. And she made it very clear that she was not going to let him have a part in making a decision about who would be her legal life mate. And that was always inspiring to me, that she exerted that autonomy in the face of this pressure from this missionary who thought he knew what was best for her.
Yes, that's so important. Like, people don't think about the loss of your choice over marriage, reproduction, your body during slavery, and how reclaiming that is a process. And this is someone doing that work. She started the process. That's awesome.
So some of my research is on Coretta Scott King. And I think I was most surprised by the sort of reaction her husband's colleagues had to her attempt to start the King Center following his assassination. That many men in the SCLC saw it as direct competition, and so did their best to, even in public, disparage her efforts and her name. And I think that wasn't necessarily surprising, but given how people have, and even sort of civil rights activists have kind of amassed like a level of sainthood to some extent, because we don't fully understand the history and the way that people understand civil rights now is outside of the context of what people thought of King, et cetera, at his death. I was just sort of startled by the fact that they were so willing to be out in the public saying she was awful and didn't know what she was doing, all because she was a woman. That was the most interesting to me, because she does not necessarily really respond to them directly, but she persists in her move and goals, and eventually gets there, but without the help of the people she had assumed would help her. And she had assumed a lot of things that didn't happen after her husband's death. So that's not really sort of about her, but it's just sort of about the reaction to her. Just sort of they were just really loud and mean and evil. All because they thought like she was going to get more donations to the King Center, and they wanted the SCLC to thrive.
Wow. The things that people have been through, women, I mean, sadly and unfortunately, Black women having to carry forward movements, carry forward, build institutions, etc., and not having the full support of even our own community sometimes is tragic. Tragic.
Mm-hmm.
We can't even have a conversation about Black women's history without some pushback. All right. So, Layla,
on that note, my point is actually kind of a continuation of that. It's less a single story and more like it's like the secret lives of radical wives. Like I'm really interested in all these biographies of like Eula Taylor's work on Amy Jacques Garvey and Gerald Horne's work on Shirley Graham Du Bois, and really the way their own political movement pushed the revolutionary or radical nature of the men who we know, right?
Right.
Because a lot of the role that Shirley Graham Du Bois played in building the media network in newly independent Ghana under Nkrumah, through that relationship with Du Bois and Nkrumah, is like so like crazy to me. Or even Garvey's first wife, the first Amy. A lot of his own kind of internationalism came from her time with students in Europe from the continent of Africa, right? And so like I'm really always interested in, and to me what that also speaks to, which is a larger thing that I always take from the work of Black women in general, is a particular kind of ethics of care and a type of engagement, right? Because I mean we could argue that like they couldn't necessarily be public because of the ways that gender was operating, but it was also like there was a commitment to a cause and they knew the way to work that because of the time. And so I also think it's important for us to be able to think more broadly about the big figures that we know and the things that inspire them. Like none of us are like individuals who just have these individual lines of thought. We're constantly being shaped. And so what I think appreciate about that, and it's something that Dr. Sharice Burden-Selly and I were talking about, is this kind of radical or mutual comradeship, which I think exists among women. And also I think it's the relationship that a lot of Black radical women have to their community. Like it's the work that I'm doing is about us, right? And it's so, and like, and as much as, I think it's our responsibility in this moment to give them their shine, they weren't doing the work for that. They were doing the work for the work's sake. And so I think that, that's what's always, I think, important to me is that, watching these women do this work with thanklessly, not that thankless should be celebrated, because it should not be celebrated, but watching them do it because of the importance of the work to them and what that means about a particular kind of ethical engagement.
I would just want to add Eslanda Robeson to that list of wives who pushed their husbands, and she did a lot, like heavy lifting for her husband Paul.
Okay, so we got to work on the secret lives of radical wives or something. To work on that project of the secret lives of the wives, and the mothers, right? And the mentors. Queen Mother Moore comes up, mentoring multiple generations from Garveyism all the way down to Black Power. We got Tontoya, right? If you're talking about the Haitian Revolution, raising Jean-Jacques Dessalines, to be a certain warrior and have a certain outlook on what was going on there. Oh my gosh, like the list goes. Or women to women relationships, right? We all started talking about women who mentored us and brought us into the profession and modeled how we can find points of entry into what we're doing. And you have who else? People like Rosa Parks need to be reimagined in that way, where she's connected with Septima Clark. Without a Septima Poinsett Clark, we don't have a Rosa Parks in the same way we have a Rosa Parks, coming through the Highlander Folk School before she sat on the doggone bus, right? And so I think that again, when we're speaking about Black women, we're always also talking about relationship, and I think that's a really, really important takeaway from this. So I'm going to stop there selfishly. With my selfish, dominance of the questions, and I'm going to open it up. I did promise Dr. Ball and Dr. Swan that they could have first crack at questions, and then they've been collecting some of the really amazing questions in the chat. So here we go. Do we have questions? If you all want to hop on, go ahead. Do you have one?
No, I just want to say this is dope, and thank you very much for putting it together. I don't have any questions that I'm gonna let other people bring them up. I don't have any questions or comments right now. I just been thoroughly enjoying watching the whole thing. Thank you all very much. This is fantastic.
Cool. Dr. Swan? Okay, he doesn't have oh, there he is.
I just want to quickly say how much I'm enjoying the dialogue. It's clear that the craft that you all have is well polished, well necessary, and I want to see my question to the audience. I think they're getting a lot. It's important to have these kind of spaces. So I'm learning a lot. I'm enjoying it. Give thanks.
Awesome. And I think that's so important to know. Like, there is a craft going on. I don't know if everyone who is here with us appreciates that. When we're talking about archives, and we're talking about the fact that we have to not just, it's not easy for us to just pick up a piece of paper and read it and then write what it says, but we have to do like the interpretive work and also the psychosocial and emotional work that involves like trying to like navigate the voids and the intensity of what is there and all of that, and then create something that is useful, right? And produce something that is useful and understandable for people to consume and have conversations and grow. That's a lot. It's a lot going on. And so expertise really does matter. I will go to the questions then. I'm going to scroll back up through the list of questions that our colleagues have been sending. Okay, so thoughts about Africana womanism, I guess as a term, as a concept. How do we feel?
I mean, for me, it's never not a part of the conversation. Like it's not something that I think dismiss. There's always a conversation that we have in our classes. Like I have one student this semester, she was like, I don't rock with feminism, I'm a womanist. And I'm like, that's cool, sis. Like that's the conversation we're having. And for me, honestly, I have no aversion to womanism, and I have no preference toward feminism. For me, I think the truth about being an intellectual is paying attention to nuance. And I think that we have to have a conversation about the work that Alice Walker was attempting to do through signaling, through making that distinction. I also think that there is a lot of work that has been done by Black women to make a kind of claim on feminism. And I think that those are both important. I like the struggle that I have with some of the comments, in the chat earlier, and even like the reading of feminism. I think based on the configuration of this panel, anyone who assumes that any of us who sit here don't have a nuanced understanding of the ways in which white bourgeois women took and tried to utilize feminism for particular kinds of racialized and classed goals or ends is, to me, insulting our intelligence. I think I have an understanding of that. Yes, I understand the ways in which these eugenics supporting white women dismissed our concerns as a community. I understand the ways in which the work that Black men were doing at the time was marginalized by the work of white women. I understand all those things. I also, like I said, I also understand the work that Black women have done to make a particular kind of claim about gendered, the gendered division of labor, the gender relationship of labor, and what our understandings of gender do for how we interact as a society and what types of limitations it puts on us. And so for me, the question about womanism or feminism, it's never been an either or for me. I think that the term feminism is often more legible to people, but womanism is never, for me, in the way that I teach, it's never erased. It's always a part of the conversation.
For me, I take everything that Dr. Brown Vincent says, especially I have to pay attention to my audience, right? So sometimes I will default to the word feminist because that's a word that people seem to, even if they get it incorrect, they are familiar with. But I just break it down to the lowest common denominator. Until I'm free, nobody's free. So again, like, you know, like you said, I understand that, you know, Black men are disproportionately, you know, killed by state violence. Yeah, I understand that. I'm on the front lines marching with you. But do you understand the ways in which Black women are harmed by state violence? Yes, I understand that white women live under the thumb of patriarchy, but have you tried patriarchy and, you know, racism at the same time? Doesn't feel that great. Like we understand the negative reaction that people have when Black women lay claim to the word feminist. Like, we get it. We've read the works, we've looked at the data, but at the end of the day, I still use that word because if that's the word I have to use to get you to understand my politics, then that's just the word I'm going to use. I'm not going to hyphenate it. I'm not going to, you know, elongate it. I'm not going to change it. If feminism puts you in the mindset of how you should talk to me when I walk into a room or how you should address me, then we can just go with that word. Because at the end of the day, until Black women are free, nobody's free. And that's the work of feminism, essentially, for me.
All right. I think my takeaway, or I guess my only intervention into this would be, if you have not read what Black women have said about it, you can't even enter into the conversation. You're not having the conversation. You're just talking. Like, if you don't know, like, on both sides of the issue, right? Whether we use the term or don't use the term, whether we like the concept, we don't like the concept. If you have not read what Black women have said about it, not just Black men, Black women themselves, you're not ready to enter into the conversation. Don't at us just yet. That's all I gotta say. Like, if you don't know what's been said about it, then you really can't be out here just, you know, because I think that, again, we have to, part of what we're talking about is Black women have taken the initiative to define these terms, right? Every woman in this panel has thought about this, read about this, not just her own personal opinion, right? We've studied the words of other women who have unpacked this terminology and taken what parts are meaningful for themselves and done something with it. And that's what scholarship means. And so that's what it means to have an intellectual conversation about it. Read Black women, cite Black women, if you're going to really have a serious conversation where you're actually trying to end up someplace, right, together.
Period. Yeah. You can stop that right there. No, I'm just
seriously. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to.
I like the book question. I don't know if that was the main chat. So, although my answer to that is there is no one. So my answer, you know, because I mean, you know, yeah, there is no one, because I think, you know, we have such a multitude of experiences. But so actually, Sharice Burton-Selly actually introduced me to Ndai's work. The point is to change the world. The point is to change the world. Who was a comrade of Walter Rodney. So I'll point out that text. But I will also say that I think the key to interrogating Black women's positionality and experience is understanding the multitudes of our experiences. And to do that, we have to read widely and deeply.
All right, I have two, just to be quick. To the point of, you need to read what Black women have said about feminism. A short, well, relatively short book you could read, edited by Keonga Yamada Taylor, How We Get Free, would be a great place to start if you want to know how Black women have interpreted for them feminism for themselves. It has interviews with, I think, 3 women who are part of the Combahee River Collective. And so you should read that. If you want to know more about what Black women have to say about feminism, it also has interviews with them, and then other stuff. The one book that came to mind when I saw this question in the chat was No Mercy Here by Sarah Haley. As Dr. Brown Vincent mentioned, we are multitudes. And I think that in that book and other books that are on carceral studies and Black women, we get a peek into how the systems, prison, in this country have treated Black women over time. And it is not the story we always get about Black women. It's about Black women who are sometimes nameless. And I think those stories are always important to tell and to hear and read.
Can I add bell hooks? Because when we think about feminism, it's always either from like, you know, political action or something like that. But Bell Hooks has a series, I think it's like her All About Love series, where she kind of reframes our understanding of love. That basically, if you want to love, if you want to be in relationships, if you want to have partnership, then that is essentially a feminist practice, right? And so I've been really like leaning on her in her analysis in these books, because like I said, we tend to just think about feminism as this public practice or, you know, this type of protest, but not really understanding how feminism should shape how we love each other, how we emote to each other, our inner lives. And Bell Hooks she just does amazing with that in that series. So that's my one.
That's a really good one. And I do want to also note that there are some really good recommendations coming through in the chat and have been throughout. Yeah. Yes. More books?
I apparently missed the question in the chat.
Oh yeah, I didn't see the question. I just assumed that it was like what books you would recommend.
Okay,
Was that the question, Dr. Brown Vincent? Yeah.
Was that the question? Okay, because
the question was actually what is the definitive book you gotta read? But that's
definitive.
Okay. And I would echo Dr. Robinson on the Bell Hook series there.
Isn't it amazing?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to date me, you have to read this book because it'll change your life. Okay.
Yeah, I was. I guess Dr. Valethia Watkins Beatty has some her own interventions into feminism. I would say she's on the against side in general, and really just urges us to go to African cultural understandings to solve much of the problems that we have with gender baggage from the Western world. Nah Dove, NAHDOVE, Nah Dove has an article where she's kind of trying to referee all of this terminology that I have my students read. You know, and we have some interesting conversations based on that. And she comes from kind of a very Afrocentric perspective on that. So yeah, and I think that it is connected to a question. I'm trying to tie in the question about international concepts of Black feminism, which Dr. Brown Vincent does a lot of work around. So again, if you're not reading Black women and then you're also not reading internationally, like, have you fully entered into the conversation? Like, you know, and I think it's important to think about it on all of the levels, right? Because as women and as humans, we exist on all the levels. Our personal, intimate world, which definitely I would co-sign with the Bell Hooks recommendation, but also like we exist on, you know, regional levels and familial levels and structural levels and international levels, you know, with the conversations that are being had about defining feminism and what might be useful about it, looking at the ways in which, you know, patriarchy impacts women of African descent around the world. Clenora Hudson Weems is another good recommendation. Oyewonke Oyewumi, The Invention of Women, is a classic at this point. I feel like this is a Yoruba writer who really focuses on the ways in which a lot of our obsession about like biologically determined gender really comes from our captivity here in the Western world, and really in many ancient African cultures, particularly she focuses on the Yoruba case, gender is less constitutive of a person's identity than their age. It is much more about seniority, and this is why we have many gender neutral names in many African cultures, and that kind of thing. It's not as body focused in terms of how we look at it in the West. And so maybe some of what we're obsessed about in these so-called gender wars really is it can be solved by looking at other ways of doing it in other parts of the world and other times. So it's something to just put on your mind, you know, and think about for more studying about this. Like, we really just should, obviously there are lots of feelings about it. So I would just urge people to just investigate what's been said here, there, and everywhere. More questions.
Can I respond to Ricky's
Sure.
question about, wait, where was it? It was something about, okay, thoughts on Western Black feminism leaving out international concepts of Black feminism.
Mm-hmm.
So this is complicated because I actually think that a part of what happens is even though as Black people and as Black women, we are marginalized, because we sit at the heart of empire, the type of work that Black women in the academy in the US do can often dominate sort of international circuits of information, particularly the Anglophone world, because of that kind of hegemonic relationship. But I would argue my experience has almost always been that Black women, we understand that the necessity of the work of international and yes, solidarity, but not just solidarity, like an actual international interrogation of the issue. And I think that's, to me, that's also a part of what naming something as feminism, even these sort of issues about race and naming the issue of capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, whatever it is that for me, that's a supranational question that I think we understand in our, whatever our local contexts are. It's not enough to answer those questions. And so the one thing that I will say, like, one of the things when I started doing research in Latin America on the Afro-Latin American organizations, what a lot of people don't know is that a lot of the work that came together to actually produce this moment where Afro-Latinos are sort of legible in terms of research and work, it came together around the crystallization of work that Afro-descended women were doing in preparation for the Durban Conference Against Racism in 2001. And it was their international planning and solidarity work that even led to this particular, I don't know if people know, but like we're in the sort of last year of the decade for people of African descent that's determined by the UN, which has its own sets of issues, but it's a part of a way of signaling, I think, the importance of the moment. A lot of my own kind of work has even been around, in the case of a lot of Latin American countries, the national census, I can never say that word in a plural, whatever. The way that they talk about race has not been quantified on the national census in most Latin American countries for over 200 years. And a lot of the work that congealed to force Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, whatever, and not all of them do. I mean, it was Afro-Brazilian women's work that really brought about the way in which we kind of colloquially understand how Black of a nation Brazil is in this moment. It was really based on a lot of the work that Afro-Brazilian women were doing, and that they were constantly doing that work across their national boundaries. So I also think that as much as we want that work to be foregrounded, I think we also always have to ask what's at stake. What's at stake in the ways that those histories are covered up, right? What's at stake in the kind of national narrative that, somehow Black women in the US are not invested in what's happening beyond the national borders of the US, right? And why we don't know certain things. Because I have found that work is always going. And part of the reason why my own work, I'm interested in the way that left organizing in this moment, I think, is a return to a particular kind of Pan-African ethos, because a lot of the way that even sort of on the ground grassroots organizing is happening in this moment is because of the connections that, I mean, even in a more basic, the connections that the young people in Ferguson were making between the sort of militarized domination there and in Palestine, right? So this last summer, after George Floyd was killed, the global outrage all across the world at what was happening wasn't just because everybody there cares about George Floyd. It was because we understand the interconnected nature of our oppression. So for me, I think, that work is often obscured, but it's being done.
Thank you for that.
Can we answer the question about archives at HBCUs versus guys?
Yeah. And please pose the question for those who don't remember it.
Let me see if I can find it.
Because I think it was something like, how do we feel about the archives being kept at HBCUs? How
do you feel about archives being kept at HBCUs versus PWIs? And I guess it means about Black people, like Africa. I would assume I'll answer first. I think in terms of who gets certain things, who is able to acquire different collections, I think this happened most recently with the Ebony pictures that were sold, and then several museums came together to buy them, and theoretically they'll be accessible to the public in some way. I think there are a lot of questions about. I think people assume a lot of things about HBCU's ability to preserve the papers and then also make them accessible. We have to sort of think about the amount of money it takes to process, manpower it takes to process papers, and whether or not some institutions are invested in that. I think this most recently came to bear with the SCLC papers, which are now at Emory, well, in my sort of realm of research, which are now at Emory, and they were at the King Center, some of them, and this debate about should these papers be at Emory, like a place where Black people couldn't go for a long time. And my take as a historian is I would just like to be able to have access. And whoever can give access, I think there is sort of, I think the stories, some Black stories would be valued more at Black places, but we need to make sure those places are resourced enough to be able to do that work. And I'm not sure, besides Howard and the Woodruff's library and at the AUC, I'm not sure who else is capable of keeping it up with the pace up, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely understand your point. It was just, I guess, for me, disappointing to write about this kind of Black topic, or, you know, having a huge chunk of it be from a Black perspective, but having to do most of my research at UNC, right? Or having to spend a lot of time at Duke and not being able to, you know, be in my own yard, so to speak, and you know, our own archives at NCCU. But then it was like through my internship there, I kind of understood why some of those collections were not at NCCU. And it wasn't, you know, reflective of the archivist, the amazing Andre Van, but more so just the type of institution the archives is, and the processes and the structure it takes to collect and arrange and preserve that unfortunately HBCUs don't either have the ability, or that's not their focus to get into that type of work. I personally, though, I remember I had to do a book review of a woman who wrote a book called The Uplift Generation, which was about the uplift conversation, race progression in Virginia post-slavery. And she wrote that entire book without going to Howard. She wrote that entire book without going to the archives at Hampton. You know, she wrote that entire book without even attempting to engage the archives of the local HBCUs in this area that would have greatly rounded out her research. So for me, I as you can tell, I have a love-hate relationship with the archives.
I would say, for instance, in the case of Morgan, we have a university archivist, Ida Jones, who is a historian, who some of you are probably familiar with, and I just think they need more people. That there's lots of papers that if people wanted to do stuff on Black people in Baltimore that aren't available just because the library doesn't have the resources to make them available. They have the papers, but they haven't been processed. So I think some, as you mentioned, Dr. Robinson, I'm not sure that all HBCUs who even have papers and archives are focused on making them available. They are focused on maybe building other things where they're getting all this new money recently, and that is not sort of where they're putting it. They're not putting it in the library or in the special collections. They're putting it into, like, I don't know, STEM or whatever. It's unfortunate because there are a lot of good papers, but they're just not readily accessible, even when they have them. And I would say there needs to be some type of thinking about how Black institutions should hold the history, and even institutions like Morgan, who do have a robust archive, don't necessarily have. She can't do it all by herself, right? I mean, so there needs to be more people so it can be available.
Yeah, I think resources. Oh, go ahead, Bridget.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say that has been my experience when I would go into HBCU archives. Is probably like one person, you know, in that entire space. And even, you know, dealing with Andre Van at NCCU, he would jump in his car if he heard, you know, somebody in the community had passed away. He would jump in his car, go to the funeral, and then ask the family, like, hey, you know, can I get your stuff? He would box it up and bring it back. Like, it was a very unconventional way that he would make sure that he preserved, you know, that community history. But he didn't really have the institutional support to make that a large scale operation.
And I know from my time of interning at the National Archives, the manpower, the woman power, and the resources that have to go into processing those collections. And that it's a lot for even an institution like that.
You mute yourself, Sharita.
Yeah. The other side of it, echoing what Dr. Robinson said, I remember being downtown at National Archives 1 and feeling a certain kind of way about the ways in which I was surveilled while doing that research, right? So, you know, being an employee of Archive 2 and doing research at Archive 1 and being surveilled in a very particular kind of way always makes me wish that we would put more resources in bringing those documents to HBCUs for people to research. But resources have to go into that.
That's right. That's right. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add to that like I also think it's important for us to have this conversation in that way, that we have to have the conversation about our institutions being intentionally under-resourced first, as opposed to, I think, kind of sometimes reifying the institutional ways in which we aren't able to do things. Like I remember even when I was an undergrad, and I think NCCU was fighting for its doctoral program in like biomedical science or whatever. But one of the things I learned about establishing a PhD program is that you have to determine a particular kind of need. And when a school like NCCU exists in the midst of a Duke University and a UNC and an NC State, it's very difficult for an NCCU to determine that they are meeting a need that's not already met, right? And so it's one of the structural ways in which HBCUs are boxed out of, and we've lost a lot of our doctoral programs and are boxed out of this process. I also, though, want to say that as a person who doesn't do a lot like conventional archival research, I want to drop my friend's name, Melanie Chambliss, who does work on the role of Black women in creating the archive, the role that Black women have played generationally in saving and documenting, and like if it weren't actually just for the and to name it in the negative way, the kind of like overly, my mother always calls stuff a pack rat, right? Like this keeping everything. It's one of the way, I mean, it's really an essential way in which the Black Studies Archive in particular exists because of all the work Black women did to save those kinds of things, right? And so I also think that like the work that Dr. Van was doing, we also have to think about the archive beyond the institution of the archive, right? There are all of these archival resources and materials, and I actually do think that is a part of what, you know, for historians, oral histories, that's what ethnographies, all those things do. They allow us to have access to the archive beyond the archive. And I also think it's really important to question the archive, right? Because a lot of times, you know, I always tell my students, the archive is the archive, not the, you know, that that most universities work with is basically like white men writing in their diaries.
Yeah.
And somehow this is fact, like because they wrote some racist crap, and this is now truth because it's been in there for 100 years, 200 years. Like your diary don't mean nothing. I don't know how you interpreted what I was doing. And so I mean, I also think it's like, you know, what's important. Like I have so much respect for people who find stuff in the archive and do all this cross-referencing to verify and validate what are all these different people saying about this particular moment. And so I mean, I also like I just want to uplift that and the work, and I think the work that Melanie's really is doing is really interesting. I think she's working on this. She has this thing called Sister Mentors. But she has, I think, she's working on a book project, Saving the Race, Black Archives and the Structuring of African American History from 1914 to 1968. But I remember, and also I think the way that the way that HBCUs create, I think, these summer research programs that allow us to start asking these questions, because it was in a summer research program for HBCU students where I met her when I was an undergrad, and all these other students who are doing this type of work that are challenging these conventional ways that we understand institutionality. And so, you know, I really do want to just uplift that. You know, a lot of the reasons why we are unable to house our materials is because we have been, you know, structured, like the ability to do that has been taken away from us intentionally so that we cannot have a particular kind of control over the narrative.
Yes. And I think that's so important. And I think I'm really enjoying the thread of this conversation where we're talking about archives out broadly defined, like the archives we create, the archives that exist in our everyday culture, the archives of the little lady in the church that collect all, not just her family Bibles, but all the Bibles with all the family trees written inside, and has all, you know, keeps all the obituaries and the announcements. Those people are our community historians. Those are our Jallis, our griots, right? Like those are the people that like I go to for information. Oral history is an archive, like you said, ethnography is an archive. So thinking about archives broadly. But to some comments that were made in the chat, like I think it is important to understand archives outside of these institutions, right? So it's not just a PWI versus HBCU and who got the money to do what conversation, but understanding the nature of certain types of archives, they do need institutional space. They do need to be housed. And it's more than a notion. Like I remember going to this one woman's basement and she had what could have been an amazing amount of information about this very important, very small, little known Black community. She had everybody's information dating back almost 150 years. In her basement, half of that stuff got messed up because it was not temperature controlled, moisture controlled, right? And she did not have the resources in her home to become an archive the way we need to archive and preserve the actual physical materials, right? So that actually matters, and resources do have to go to that. Now, if we want to talk about doing that on a community level outside of these universities, then that's really an important conversation to have. But these are important spaces, right? While we have them and the resources are there or they're not there. I wanted to say, like, for me, it's been interesting because my dissertation research is during the era of American racial chattel slavery, and it's the 18th century, and it's tough because if I'm studying, whether I'm talking about what happened here in the colonies or in the Caribbean colonies, I had to go to England for a lot of this stuff, right? And to a point that Bridget made, that Dr. Robinson made, it was so, I almost felt naked walking through the National Archives in the UK. Like I felt, because I was trying to find enslaved African women and the rituals that they participated in before they would go into a revolt or an act of rebellion. Like, and I had to and I was like, okay, so they brought fish to her house, and someone got grave dirt from her sister's grave, and they all drank, rum, and I'm reading all these, trial records and women who were hanged and burned and broken on wheels, and I had to first of all, it was kind of traumatic. I literally had to put on all my good juju and pray up, because it was depressing to see how not only were these Black women punished in just barbaric ways for fighting for freedom with their spirits and their bodies and their minds and strategies, but that they were forgotten because they were women, y'all. They weren't in the story. Like, we hear about Nat Turner, we don't hear about none of the other women involved with Nat Turner, right? Like that's the problem. And like I was carrying that, and I had to go talk to these British archivists who were well-intentioned, but I had to try to convey to them, I'm looking for rituals. They were like, what? Like that's cute, but what even is that? Like I needed to try to speak a language to convey to them. Like I had to try to find something that's not written down. Slaveholders and these, you know, these colonial courts did not write down. They did a ritual, an ancestral ritual to bless this action that they were about to take. They wrote, they gathered at Sarah's house with fish and some diabolical, you know, like, you know, I gotta like try to convey to them what I'm looking for, and they're not understanding me, and they, you know, they're halfway like smirking, like this is really ridiculous, like that's, you know. So there's a cultural divide sometimes, trying to find what we're looking for to tell an African story or a Black story from the perspective of the people, because the archivists really are the gatekeepers. Like this guy, I have to rely on him to go pull the records that I need, and he's going to go find what he thinks I need. He's going to find what he thinks fits what I'm trying to convey, and he brought me back a ton of stuff I could have used. You know what I mean? So there's so many dynamics there. And I think for that reason, I'm definitely like HBCUs would be great, because it was so different doing research on folklore at Hampton, right? At the Hampton Archives, where it was definitely under-resourced and it was hot as hell in there and it was tiny. But the person that was working with me held the archives in a certain way. You know what I mean? Like I always feel like I'm walking into an archive with a bunch of ancestors and they look like they look. And I'm like, okay, it's me and a bunch of African women with necklaces made out of British men's teeth, standing in this air-conditioned, very nice room. Like, I feel like we just out of place. But when I went to Hampton, and it was a bunch of, you know, Black women and men who were, you know, starting the Hampton Folklore Society, I was like, oh, okay, we good here. Like this is home, and we can all stand in this room and not feel out of place. I don't know if I'm being clear. No, that's but like, yeah, so even though the resources weren't there, and it was kind of tough because they hadn't even got to the point where they had digitized any of that stuff, it wasn't easily searchable for me. I felt personally, culturally comfortable in that space. So it's tough to have to reach here and there and reach across your identity and culture to find what you're looking for. I mean, like I said, like scholars who do this type of work, studying our history and culture, like y'all, it is more than a notion. All right, that's all I wanted to say. Next, I guess that helps me answer the question about conjure women. Conjure women are important in our history. Women who practice African-based spiritual traditions, and so much of that found its way into the Black church. And so, you know, in some ways we're still, you know, it's Africanized Christianity, it's Africanized Islam, it is hoodoo, and it's all those people were super important, because most African people understood that bondage was existing on a physical level, but they made sure that on a spiritual level they had to be free. It reminded them that they were humans, you know, that deserved something called freedom, that is their natural state of being. And these rituals and these practices and these ways of care, self-care, herbalism, help them to not only maintain strength, but to call in the spiritual resources and the strategies and the poisons and everything else that they could use to get free. So without those women, you don't have these revolts. Like you don't even, and again, we don't talk about them. So if you're not talking about women in the question of slave revolts, for so-called slave revolts or African insurrections during slavery, then you're not really having the full conversation, because they needed permission from above and beyond in order to do a lot of that stuff. Okay, more questions. There was some other questions. I'm not sure if they're necessarily history related. We have a question about popular media. There's a question about the portrayal of interracial relationships in popular media. I'm not sure if that's a historical question, but I would like to ask a question about an item of popular media, which is a documentary called No. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. It's about rape culture. But if you have seen it, and I think it definitely brings forth the stories of Black women and girls. And I think, just.
And the ways that rape is a construction that is even off limits to us. We're not even constructed as being possible, as being, the victims of rape.
Is it streaming somewhere?
The imagined victim of rape is white.
Yes. And it's no with an exclamation point.
Where
it's just no, the rape documentary. I think is what is it? What is it? Shahida Williams, I think.
Yes. Let me double check.
Is that on a streaming service of some sort?
It should be on Canopy.
No, the rape documentary .org.
Okay.
And it's Aisha Shahida Simmons.
I never remember Shahida.
Yeah. But these are really important conversations to be had. And I think someone recommended the book At the Dark End of the Street, which also brings in rape and sexual abuse and harassment that Black women endured, particularly during the civil rights or the Black freedom struggles of the 50s, 60s, or even before and after. And so it's a constant narrative of Black women and girls in this environment, rape. And it's something that we tend to be polite about.
Yeah, I think for me, like it was one part of my research that was very traumatizing for me is seeing how when I was dealing with sterilization. So in order for you to be sterilized by the state, you had to be brought before the board, and you were given like some sort of hearing, and you were in front of like I think about 5 white men who were actual state government officials, and you could be brought before the board by, being a victim of rape, right? There was one particular minutes that I read where an uncle could not stop, right, molesting his niece. And so the parents figured out a way that would make it stop, was to forcibly sterilize her. And she was like 16, right? A lot of stories like that came through. A lot of young Black women were sterilized because they were victims of rape, but somehow being a Black girl, the onus of rape was always on their shoulders. It was always their fault, in that they now have to live a life where they're unable to have healthy relationships and, have children of their own because they are taken advantage of by members of their own family. Fathers would bring their daughters before the sterilization board and sterilize their daughters or recommend them for sterilization because they felt like she was too, I guess, like the word like she was too fast, right? Or she had the potential to be too fast, or puberty was hitting too hard, and they're attracted to their daughters. So they would recommend their daughters for sterilization. And it was like really it just reinforced what, us 5 already know, but it was very traumatizing, that part of my research.
And I just want to call out the ways that continues today. Our construction of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls as fast and somehow responsible for the inability of grown men to control themselves. We have to, like, even in calling them fast, right? We are putting the onus on the child. They are a child. Like, I don't care if her breasts are a triple D and her butt is however, like, she's a child. And it's our responsibility to allow children to be children, no matter how their body might develop out of time, in order for where they are in their lives. And so even those logics continue to carry over, right? In the way that we understand Black women as seductresses who are entrapping people, right? All of that is a part of, the interplay between the sort of Black book narrative and the Black woman as the sexual seductress, like it just keeps playing off of one another, right? Like, Black men are overly sexualized because they have to meet the overly sexualized needs of Black women, right? And it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And we have to interrogate the ways that we internalize those own narratives, particularly with our children.
That's right. There's a study that came out recently. I'm not sure of the exact title, but I think it's something like the adultification of Black girls. And I haven't read it, but I'm like, thank goodness that they put it all together and that there's data for this now. And we really understand the ways in which Black girls are adultified and pushed and perceived as adults but not just adult women, right? Because they're criminalized and over sexualized in a way that white women aren't, white girls aren't. And that we now have, again, language for this. But if you didn't take the time to say this is an issue faced by Black girls because someone told you shouldn't do that, then we don't have the data, we don't have the knowledge, we're not able to really talk about it and then solve it, right, and address it. We don't have the interpretive skills. I remember the New York African Burial Ground, when that was like the thing people were talking about, and we were looking at the burials, and they had these African spiritual practitioners and these people, you know, various people from West African societies come and interpret the bones. I was like, that's so important. But you know, sometimes, you know, and you read the archaeological reports and stuff like that, and sometimes I'm like, they get so much right with the cultural lenses, but then sometimes they don't raise the women questions. Right? Why did this 19-year-old enslaved woman in burial number 340 wear these waist beads? Was it just because she was trying to be sexy and cute in the context of slavery? Or did the cowrie shells and these green beads, was this a form of healing because her body had been violated? Right? These are the things that come into my head when I'm thinking about interpreting art and artifacts and documents. Like, those are the questions I'm raising. Like, is this a form of healing? What are we addressing here? Is it, you know what I mean? Or are we just going to dismiss it and say it's decorative, right? And I think that, again, without having that lens, then we miss a lot of the story. And I thank you all for just, because these, you know, even the speculating, right? You have it on the page, right? The devastating stories that Dr. Robinson is just talking about. And then you have like all the speculating that comes into your head, and it just drives you crazy because you're just thinking like, oh my gosh, like, okay, I know this herb is used to shore up bleeding in this area. Why did they grow this in the back of this plantation? What was going on here that they needed a whole grove of this right here? Like, what is, you know, someone who's not doing that work or raising those questions would not notice, and they would not raise that question. They would not have an answer. So yeah, and yeah, thank you for that. I think someone asked a question related to resources that we might know of for curricular development for high school, middle school, like K through 12, in terms of studying Black women's history and culture. I know it's kind of outside of our wheelhouse.
I'm really sad to not have an offer to that, because I think, for me, I think part of the issue with the public school curriculum is that it just, we already know that the way that curriculum works, it already invisibilizes us, even at the collegiate level. And I'm sure that like, you know, it's nice at the collegiate level because you get a little bit more control over your stuff. But, you know, the types of surveillance that public school teachers, the handful of them who actually are trying to nurture our children, that, you know, the type of things that they're up against when they're actually trying to do work that takes care of our kids, like, such a struggle. So I wish I had more to say, but I don't. So.
Yeah.
I think Asala has like teaching guides. I feel like they do. The Association for Study of African American Life and History, ASALH.org, I think is their website. I'm pretty sure they do have resources for K through 12 on their website that might be helpful for you. They might not necessarily be specific to Black women's history, but they would be Black history related. And so obviously women will be there too. So I would go there for resources.
And I also think Dr. Swan is working with the Boston Public Schools with the at the moment with the Trotter. And so, you know, that might be a thing we want to impress upon him to, you know, push to make sure that curriculum reflects the experiences of Black women as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Swan. Also, I guess we have a question about the question of Afro-Indigenous women. So someone from the West Coast is saying, you know, and brought up a really important point, like, you know, in some areas, if we're talking about the West Coast going into, you know, for instance, Central America, we have like this Afro-Indigenous cultural, you know, confluence going on. Like, well, how do we talk about them? Are they a part of the conversation? I don't offhand know of any Afro-Indigenous scholars that are talking about it necessarily in that way, but that's just my blind spot.
I am currently guest editing a special issue for the of Interface Journal, which is actually particularly trying to highlight the work of Indigenous and Afro-descendant movements in Latin America in particular, although it's also looking at some stuff that's happening in the US, other places. So that's something that we're actually trying to do, is pull together the ways people are thinking about African and Indigenous, and then also like people who are actually identify as Afro-Indigenous, right? Which I think is both about the interplay between the communities and then those people who exist at the intersections of those communities. So, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know them offhand because it's not really my bag, but I know there are people doing that work. So maybe, you know, if there are follow-up, maybe I can do a little bit more digging to try to remind myself of what those are.
Thank you. Well, it's pushing 7, and I realize that we've had you all on here for 2 hours talking and sharing amazing experiences and expertise. We have had so much in this chat that is of value. I just want to amplify all of that. And we obviously need to have a lot more of these conversations. There's a whole world, like there's a whole field of scholarship going on. So many unsung heroes and unheard voices and all kinds of dynamics that happen with research and writing and teaching. And I thank you all so much for joining us and for sharing all of those things with us and putting so much on our minds. I got more reading to do. And yeah, so yeah, someone proposed in the chat that this be some sort of series. I definitely think we need to do much more of this. Any last thoughts, anything else they want to say, you want to put out to the world that is listening? And also, if you feel like it, please share your Instagram, or if you have Twitter, or wherever you exist on social media, if you'd like to share. How can they find you?
I don't exist for the public.
Yeah, I don't.
We can look you up at Morgan State.
Yes, Morgan.edu.
Right. Look
Right.
at my first and last name at me.com. There you go.
All right. And oh, Dr. Brown Vincent, can we find you on an internet?
Yeah, I was going to try to type and I actually realized that I pressed log out. I'm gonna put it here and let somebody who can get into the main chat share it.
Oh, okay.
But it's Pan-African. You said social media, yeah.
Mm-hmm, yeah. If you feel like sharing, and I'm on social media. My first and last name are my, all together one word is my Instagram and my name. I'm on Facebook and stuff. I don't really, I'm on Twitter. At DRICHILE, Dr. Ichile. Yeah, please join us. Please continue the conversations, and please do look up these women scholars and their very important work. I mean, we've covered all kinds of time periods and histories on all kinds, local levels, international. We've gone a lot of places. Thank you so much. I have enjoyed every minute of this. And we will see you in the future with much more programming. You have any final words?
I actually did not mean to put myself on the screen.
Oh,
I just want to say thank you. Since I'm here, thank you all very much. This was fantastic. And I apologize for the interruption, but thank you all very much. It was great to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yes. Thanks for the invitation.
Bye.